I said, you got that close-up concentrated view of trying to find the right button to push.
I love that part. Okay, we are officially at 3:30, and as our promise, we always stick right on it, right? We may have people joining us as we come along. So welcome to part 2 of our leadership. Today's going to be really exciting because we have Dr. Mike Murray returning to us, but now giving us like the skills. So with that, I'm going to get us started right away, Dr. Murray. So we all have our beverages.
Okay.
Turning it over to you, my friend.
So I mentioned yesterday that toast is a celebration. So I'm going to invite everyone to celebrate themselves. So I would like everyone to repeat these words as we toast. And it is, here's to what's great about me. All right?
Okay.
So here we go. Here's to what's
great about me. Cheers.
Right. Cheers. And I'll have something else in this Guinness glass in a little while.
At first I thought that was Blue Moon. I wasn't sure. I was like, is that Guinness? Is it Blue Moon?
So show of hands, who was a little bit or a lot of bit uncomfortable about saying, here's to what's great about me, especially in front of other people? Anybody? A little bit? Okay. And that makes sense because from an early age, we're told not to brag about ourselves. It's being conceited. And so that can be actually a little uncomfortable for people. What I'm going to ask you to do is right now in 30 seconds, write down at least 1, but up to 3 things about you that are great. I'm trying to get my counter to work, my clock, and it's not, so.
Okay, I got you, Mike, when I yell at you.
All right.
I'm a little chilled.
So does anyone want to share what they wrote that was great about them?
Wait.
Okay. Team
Go
player.
ahead, Julie.
Team player.
Ooh, I like team player. That's awesome.
I wrote intentional.
Okay.
I think that, I'm always positive, and I see all problems as opportunities, as
Nice. What I love about that is you now are going to take over and do this for me. So one of the reasons that I asked you to think about what's great about you is because the title of this session is who you are versus how you are. And a lot of times we don't really think about the greatness of who we are. And I think part of effective leadership is to have that belief about what's great about us, not from a insecure ego standpoint, but really, what is it about us that's great that we can bring to the world? So is anybody on the call today who wasn't on yesterday? Okay, great. So I don't really have to summarize other than I just want to remind us that the definition of leadership that I really love is that a leader is the person in an interaction who has the greater influence. Okay, and so it isn't that the leader is the person who is in charge necessarily. It isn't the person who is at the top of the org chart necessarily. It's all of us. In fact, there was a gentleman who has 250 employees among his hospitals, and I made the comment that, well, it sounds like you have 250 leaders in your organization. And so the reason I wanted to talk about what's great about us is that the first step, I think, to effective leadership is to understand who we are and to be who we are. And who we are is largely dependent on our genetics, right? Mom and dad has a lot to do with who we are. Also, who we are has to do with our experiences, particularly our experiences in our early developmental ages. Those experiences stay with us, particularly the emotional impact that they had, and we often, our stress response is triggered by those kinds of experiences that we had, for me, 50 years ago. And then also our values largely determine who we are. The point being is who we are is pretty much fixed. We don't really change who we are over a long period of time. There may be some evolution, but essentially who I am now is who I was way long time ago. How we are, though, how we show up, particularly along that spectrum of stress to success mindset, that is something that, in fact, we can evolve and change. So who we are is just fine. And the reason I bring that up is we tend to get a lot of messages about we need to change who we are. Need to change this about you, Catherine. You know, you're really strong in this area, but you've got these weaknesses. You should really work on these weaknesses. Personality assessments that you may have taken, depending on what they are. You know, some of them are used to point out what we need to do better, how we need to be better. And the message we get is, with these unintentionally, I think, but still, is that somehow I'm not good enough. And that's a killer. You know, it's counterproductive. And yet it's what a lot of, you know, you do corporate 360s, and, you know, they can serve a very good purpose, but they end up being kind of beat up sessions where, you know, you leave going, well, I'm not good enough. And so who we are is just fine. It's actually great. And we don't need to change who we are. Does that, I mean, I'd be curious of your thoughts on that.
I like that notion, because I think that you do walk into every personality assessment like, what's gonna, you know, what are they gonna say this time? Or we predispose ourselves for what we think we pre-assign what we think the outcome should be. And so I stress out whenever I take those tests. Am I answering this the right way? So I think it's really smart. Yep.
And in a second, I'll share with you the output of a personality assessment I took recently that I thought it was phenomenal. Not that it said I was so great, but just the output itself was very interesting. So in fact, how we are is something that we can modify. Who we are is who we are, and it's great. How we are is how we show up along that stress to success spectrum. And we, in fact, we form engagement patterns of where our energy is along this spectrum. And those engagement patterns kind of get fairly old and stale after a while. I mean, it's what we go to habitually over and over again, how we respond to situations, and those can limit us. So there is an opportunity in being, you know, more aware of how we show up along that stress to success spectrum, and we can change our engagement patterns according to what is appropriate and needed in the situation. So here's an example of the difference between who we are and how we are. So I've taken a lot of personality assessments, and, you know, there's Myers-Briggs and DISC, and there's Caliper, and there's, you know, dozens of them. There's one I took recently. It's called Fascinate, and it's by Sally Hogshead. And the output is she's got about 20 or so different personality archetypes. And mine came out as provocateur. Now, for those who know me, they would go, that's probably spot on. In fact, it was so spot on, I could think back to when I was, you know, knee-high to a grasshopper, and I was a provocateur. And by provocateur, I mean somebody who was saying, you know, we can strive for more, we can do better, we can, it's, you know, how can we continue to evolve as individuals, as groups, etc. So that's who I am. And that just really was kind of really cool to see that, because, like, man, that is who I am. Now, how that shows up, what it looks like to others, is dependent upon whether I and they are in a stress mindset or a success mindset. So if I'm in a stress mindset, what it looks like is I'm being critical. And I am. In a stress mindset, that provocateur comes off as being very critical. When I'm in a success mindset, it comes off as being a provocative empathizer. And in fact, people I work with in my coaching, they say, yeah, you know, I felt like you really listened, really heard, and you challenged me. And that's what what a provocative empathizer is. Now, if I'm in my success mindset and someone else is in a stress mindset, it can still come off as sounding critical to them. that, they don't feel like they're good enough because they're in their stress mindset. So I have to be very mindful, not only of where I am along my spectrum of stress to success mindset, but also where other people are along their spectrum. So let me just, ask you for thoughts, questions on that. Okay, because it's kind of a big point. It's the who we are versus how we are, and how we show up and how other people respond to how we show up. Because here's a really interesting and I think important consideration is when we are in a stress mindset, our stress response is kicked in, we are not likable. I'm not likable, you're not likable, no one is likable when they're in a stress response, mainly because when we're in a stress response, it's all about me. It is a self-protective physiologic reaction to protect me, and it's about me. And we are in a form of stress response even when we're real busy trying to get stuff done, meeting objectives, seeing appointments one after the next, whatever it is that we're doing in our busy lives to get things done. We are in a physiologic stress response. And when we are at that place, we are not all that likable. So think about work where, people at work, whether it's in the veterinary practice or an office or wherever, are in that mindset almost all the time. I mean, think about people, are they all that likable? Not necessarily at work. Now you get outside of work and you go out for cocktails or say, hey, what a great guy, what a great person. But sometimes in the office, I love the cat tail here. Sometimes, it's people aren't necessarily all that likable. Why does that matter? Well, you might say, well, I don't care at work if they like me or not. It isn't really whether you're likable or not. It's when you're in that stress mindset, your ability to influence the other person. And remember, that's what we say a leader is the person who has the greater influence in the situation is diminished. So when we're in our stress mindset, we're not that likable, and that means that we have less opportunity to influence in a situation. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like that a lot, actually. I think that's good.
So here's an example. Now think of somebody that you don't like, somebody that you have to deal with, maybe a colleague, a client that comes into the practice. They're a good client because they spend a lot of money, but God, they're a pain in the butt. A customer you may have that, they're a big account, but man, I don't like that person at all. Your boss, whoever it might be, there's people that we deal with that we just don't like. Now think about this. What we don't like is that person and their stress response. It's not who they are, it's how they are. Because we could deal with that person in a completely different setting and situation and go, wow, that jerk really is pretty cool. I didn't realize that. But if all we do is deal with people in that stress response mode, that's how we tend to think of them. So let me just get a show of hands. How many of you are in veterinary practice? 2. And how many of you are in industry, corporate, else? Okay.
Julie.
Well, this could be a client in the vet clinic, or it could be a customer, but let's say it's Mrs. Smith who comes into your practice, and she's the one that drops a lot of money, but she's such a pain. And for some reason, Mrs. Smith really likes Julie. So Julie always has to be the one that goes in to deal with Mrs. Smith. And Julie hates Mrs. Smith. Doesn't know why Mrs. Smith likes her, but that's what she gets is Mrs. Smith. Or perhaps you have a customer, a big client, a big account, and all they do is complain. Nothing that you do is good enough. In fact, I'm working with somebody now who's got that client. And so in that situation, what can you do? You can go and you can, just kind of try to get her done, move on from Mrs. Smith or whatever. At one point, you might just say, Mrs. Smith, I've had it with you. I'm not doing this anymore. You're just despicable. You could react. Another choice that you have is to go, wow, you know, this person is really unlikable. I wonder what is stressing them so much. Now, when we do that, a magical thing happens. We get out of our emotional trigger, stress response, and we start thinking. And there's actually a disconnect in our brain. It shuts down that stress reaction. And we go, I wonder what's stressing Mrs. Smith. Now, I don't know, you don't know what's stressing Mrs. Smith because she doesn't really talk about her life that much. But it's not important that you know what it is other than to recognize that there is something stressing her in her life. It may be coming to the veterinary practice. It may be something nothing to do with that. But she's unlikable and horrible because of something else. It's not about you. So now you don't have to take it personally, and you're less likely to react. So now what's the leadership opportunity? It's to be able to, remember before I said you could be in your success mindset, oh, I really want to help Mrs. Smith and Trixie and all that, or I really want to help this client that from this account I always have to work with because he's so stressed out. I mean, I'd love to be able to really give him what he needs. But if that person's deep in their stress reaction, it doesn't matter that you're in your success mindset. You've got to help move them towards you. You need to kind of get moved towards them, get them moving towards you, and then maybe together you can move a little bit further along the success part of that spectrum. So how do you do that? Start by, and I know a lot of you are very familiar with using open-ended questions, and particularly in the context of getting information about the pet. Well, use open-ended questions with Mrs. Smith. So Mrs. Smith, I can tell you're kind of upset today. Tell me what's going on. And she said, yeah, well, nothing at all, nothing at all. Well, really? I mean, so I just noticed that, you know, there's something, you mind sharing with me? Is there something about the practice, or tell me what's going on? Usually when you give people an opening to tell you what's going on, they're, you know, watch out, stand back, here it comes, they're gonna tell you. The customer that you know, is always complaining about, you know, you're too expensive. So Joe, you know, I hear what you're saying, that something, you know, tell me what's going on. And then be ready for them to tell you about it. And number one, do not try to fix it at all at this point. Don't try to fix it. And most of us are problem solvers and fixers. So our natural inclination is, if we don't get defensive and make excuses, is say, well, Mrs. Smith, let's figure out how we can fix that. The best approach is listen and reflect back what you hear. Okay, so Mrs. Smith, so, oh man, that's awful. Your sister's been sick. So what's going on? Oh, so she's been in the hospital. So, you know, what have you had to do with that? And so you're just really getting her to talk, to open up. The key is what you're doing is you're letting her feel heard. You're letting the other person feel heard. And there's one simple reason for that. Well, there's two. I mean, if you want to be compassionate and caring, but the real reason in the leadership context is they won't listen to you, and you will not have the ability to have influence until they feel heard. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So how much time do we have, Catherine? I can't hear you.
Muted myself and I got blocked because I was looking because of the dog. So right now we actually have about 7 minutes left.
Okay.
Well, one of the questions that I had is, what if when time's an issue? So I appreciate what you're saying about, you know, trying to really listen, but I have an instance that I have someone who's incredibly stressed out. And it's the same reason every time. It's work, it's work, it's work. But if I do even try to peel back the onion, an hour will have gone by and then the phone call ends because they've got to go to the next meeting. And as we talked about yesterday, very task oriented and agenda based.
Yeah.
And so then I have gotten nothing done.
Right.
And it is
That's a really good question, Catherine. And this is how I would answer it. Because what you don't want to do is be in the exam room for an hour hearing all about Mrs. Smith's life. And
You have to
Hold that up again.
Wait,
Beth?
hold that up again. What does that say? Say less, ask more, and change the way you lead forever. Okay.
Oh, good.
It's called the coaching habit. It's how to ask these open-ended questions in order to get somebody to wrap it up, basically.
I need that book.
And
I need
so-
that book.
So the idea is not to just keep saying what's going on, but to at some point be able to get to sort of the money question. And here's the money question. And so when you need to kind of, and to the person like you're talking about, Catherine, what you may need to just say is, okay, I hear that all this stuff is going on. What would help you the most right now? And the reason I call it the money question is because what it'll do is it'll get the person to stop and think, wow, what would help me the most right now? And even if you just do that, you've taken them out of their emotional response and you've kind of shifted them up a little bit along that spectrum. And so you might have started, a part like this, and you kind of come down to where they are to learn more about their situation. And if you can just get them to come up a little bit more, now you are close enough that you can actually move forward together and accomplish something, whether it's with her pet in the exam room, whether it's with this customer that your big account, whether it's with this individual that you just mentioned, Catherine. I noticed that, whatever it is you notice, what would help you the most right now?
And then how do you pivot from that to, now we got to get work done?
Well, when they tell you what it is, I'm saying if it's in the context of, a situation where you're working with a customer, it sounds to me like this is, I need to get this person out of their stress mode so we can get something else done.
Correct.
Still, I would ask that question.
No, I think it's a powerful question.
Because the pivot is let them tell you and then say, okay, what I'm hearing is, how can we do that right now? Because we've got a lot we need to get done. So I'm trying to figure out what would help you right now. It isn't solving all their problems or whatever. It's just really trying to get to how do we get to something right now that brings us closer together that we can then move forward. Does that make sense? You're muted. This is the quietest Catherine's ever been. How about the rest of you? What are your thoughts on that? What's the situation where you've had where either you've done something like that or you think it might be helpful?
Well, I see when people are unloading or something, ask another question, and what is on your mind most important now? Well, what is what you need now? And then they have to focus on at least the now, here and now, instead of all the past baggage and stuff like that, and all the anticipated baggage.
Right, because you're not trying to fix what's stressing them in the big picture. Because you're not their psychiatrist, you're not able to do any of that, but it's what would help you right now. And usually people will tell you. And then good, now let's do that. Let's work with that. Now sometimes people just won't play nice. Sometimes they just won't, move along the spectrum with you. And sometimes a leader has to go into their own stress mindset. So a lot of times we hear about leaders, there are all these benevolent qualities of leaders that, we look for. Sometimes as a leader, you need to be in the stress mindset. You might need to confront somebody. You might need to hold somebody accountable. It's not all trust and collaboration in the real world. So in Mrs. Smith's situation, you might say, Mrs. Smith, you've been coming to our hospital, and this is Julie talking, not me. You've been coming to our hospital for years. We really appreciate your loyalty and your business. But I got to tell you, it seems like we just aren't doing what you want. It seems like we're just not good enough. We're not making the grade. Can you tell us how we could help you? Or why don't you tell us something, why do you keep coming? Tell us what we do right. So really confronting Mrs. Smith, because she shouldn't be just, coming in every time making Julie's life miserable. So what do we do great? She might say, well, what's great about you, Julie? I feel like I can talk to you about anything. Whatever it is she says. But, it's confronting, but in a way that puts them on the spot to say, well, what do you like about our business? So this is for your customer in this important account. Why do you keep doing business with us? Well, you don't necessarily have to say it that way, but, Jeff, all I'm hearing about what's wrong, but tell us what's right. Tell me what's right. So, sometimes you have to do that. You have to confront. Sometimes leader has to defend. And certainly in business, you have to compete, which is in the stress part of the spectrum. So really, I think to sum it up, as we think about this spectrum from stress mindset to success mindset, we want to have agility along the entire spectrum. And we want to be able to apply the stress mindset or success mindset to the situation and according to what's needed in that moment.
That's really good because you're right at your time. Woohoo! So for those who need to jump off at the 25-minute mark, you certainly can. For those who want to stick on and ask a few more questions of Dr. Murray, you certainly can as well, because that's usually where the fun stuff is. So just for a few minutes. So we'll open up the floor to any other questions or comments. And I absolutely love the name of the book. Deb, you may want to quickly put that in the chat for everybody so everyone can see that if they want to write it down.
And here's an article that came out in Harvard Business Review recently that I found on LinkedIn.
How do you develop empathy for someone who annoys you?
Yeah. And the one thing I'll say is it's got this heart there. And a lot of times people confuse empathy with sympathy or compassion. So cognitive empathy, which is this, open-ended questions, understanding the other person's perspective, helping them feel heard and understood, is not so much from the heart. It really is its head. It's asking questions, it's learning their perspective. And the objective of it is twofold. One is to understand the perspective, but also it's to have them feel heard and understood so you can kind of move them out of their stress response. And that's how a way that you can have influence in that interaction.
Interesting. My sister used to always say to me, there's a fine line between pity and empathy, because they're both feeling pieces, right? And one is you hold the anger in on, or are making judgments on the other person, whereas the other is understanding what's happening.
So sympathy is feeling sorry for someone from our perspective. So example I use is someone's father passes away. And you send them a note saying, "Jay, I'm so sorry. Gosh, you must feel horrible." They go, "No, actually, I feel great. I hated the old guy." Or, "No, I'm inheriting $1 billion. Yay!" But so we project our feeling into the situation with sympathy. With empathy, it's about the other person's perspective. And there's cognitive empathy, and then there's sensing empathy. Sensing empathy is where you have, you actually can understand how the other person feels without even having to talk to them. You just get it. And there are people who are highly empathic and they just sense it. And they grew up in an environment where that served them, or they were around highly empathic people. And functional MRI studies actually can show the difference between cognitive empathy and sensing empathy. It's really fascinating. We use different parts of our brain.
Wow, that's interesting. That's really interesting. Julie, do you have anything? Or Diane or Dr. Bradford?
So Julie, when are you going to give Mrs. Smith hell?
Quietly fire her, you mean? Or
well,
no.
Have you had Mrs. Smith in your
Oh, yeah.
experience?
In fact,
So
I got wedding gifts from Mrs. Smith a while back when I was in practice.
So how did you deal with Mrs. Smith? And maybe even now, how would you deal with her now, in an ideal situation?
Well, really what you said, Mike, was so true, is that you ask what's wrong, what can I do to help you? And they don't necessarily think that they are coming off that way either. They take a step back, and like you said, we like coming to you. Max likes to see you. He's more comfortable with you, but they're just concerned, and you have to take a look at how they're viewing things.
So you bring up a really interesting point, which when it comes to behavior is what we notice in other people. It's how we judge other people. We are often completely unaware of our own behavior. So Mrs. Smith probably doesn't realize she's coming off as just this horrible thing, and when we're in our stress mindset, we're so focused on me that we're just not aware of how me is affecting you. And we're all like that, it's just human beings.
Well, with that, if we don't have any more, we will go ahead and let everyone ponder this. I was thinking I need to put this question. I still have my Be Curious right here from yesterday, but now I need to follow it up with that really powerful, what can I do to help you most right now? And so I'm just going to keep that right next because I want to be curious, but I'm also very task-oriented, so I want to come across at least kind of nice.
And again, I want you to really go away with this concept of who you are versus how you are, and that who you are is perfectly fine. I think that's a message we need to hear more and more.
I think that's very good. Any parting shots from everybody?
Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, I was going to say thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. The book is on the group chat there.
Thank you so much. And Diane, how many cats do you have? Because I think I've seen 2.
Yes.
Okay, I've seen 2. So they've been different ones each time. I'm just making sure. It's awesome. All right, you guys, listen.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of the day, and enjoy your leadership and your